Hi, I'm David. This is Raksha.
I'm Nicholas Harvey. Welcome to Three Distinct Knobs.
You get third billing after the talk. This is our special Explain It Like I'm 5 edition. And this time we're doing
Lucinda
Pendleton, Morgan, Harris, Smith, question mark. So, in order for this to make more sense, you might want to listen to the one about the Morgan affair. So, Lucinda Pendleton was married to William Morgan of the Morgan affair. And when Morgan died, mysteriously, we really don't know what happened to him for sure. So, whatever happened to him, he disappeared. And Lucinda was left as his presumptive widow. We, again, we don't know that he wasn't living the high life in Canada. She was paraded around the country by the anti-Masonic party. She evidently had blonde hair and blue eyes and was fairly beautiful. And they were very delighted to have her sit on a stage so that they could do, look at the poor woman that the Masons have made a widow. And she did that for a while. And then right before the presidential election, so bad timing on her part from the point of view of the anti-Masonic party, she met a guy named George Harris, who was a silversmith in Batavia, and she and George got married. And George was expelled from the Grand Lodge of New York prior to this, and I have no reason, I don't know the reason for that. I would love to know. If you're a New York Mason, and you have access to the Grand Lodge of New York's disciplinary records from the 1839 period, 1837 period, look it up and let me know. Anyway, George Harris and Lucinda then, at this point in time, if you're familiar with the history of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, this is where Joseph Smith in New York, Batavia is very close to where Joseph Smith was, and so it became a hot ground for people joining the Mormon Church, and Lucinda and George Harris joined the Mormon Church. And as a result of that, they chose to move to Indiana, where they were starting sort of an enclave of Mormons, sort of a settlement that was going to be all Mormons. And they moved to Indiana, and shortly after they moved to Indiana, one of the Mormon apostles, and that's an office in the LDS Church, came through and encouraged them to go ahead and move on to Illinois, to a place called Nauvoo, Illinois. And that is, Nauvoo is famous in Mormon history because it's where the first Mormon temple was established, among other things. And it is also the place where Joseph Smith ends up being murdered. Lucinda moves down there with George Harris. And in short order, Lucinda is accounted among the controversial plural wives of Joseph Smith. She's controversial because she remains legally married to George Harris. But she considered herself, and we know from her letters that she wrote other people that have entered the historical record, that she considered herself to be in a plural marriage with Joseph Smith. And she encouraged other women to accept the idea of plural marriage as a part of Mormon doctrine. Okay. So, well, I would encourage anyone who's not familiar with Mormon theology or Mormon history to take a pause and realize that a lot of what Joseph Smith was dealing with were problems of the day. So for things that seem odd to us as choices that he made are less odd when you consider that he was trying to solve problems that existed. There were a lot more women than men extant in his community because there were a lot more men being killed and dying than women, so you had all these leftover women who needed someone to take care of them. So having a man take care of two wives kind of makes sense, and it's biblical. King David had more than one wife, so baptism of the dead. If you have a church that's formed, as Joseph Smith did, and before he really develops all of his doctrine, his own brother dies, and you want to assure that your relatives that you love have the opportunity for salvation, but they've passed away, that doctrine may be very comforting to you. Sealing families forever, that your family will be reunited in heaven if they're sealed in the temple. If you have children running off to the west and saying, "Bye, Dad, you may never know if I lived or died. You may never hear from me again. I've gone off to make my fortune in the west." It may be very comforting to you to think that in the afterlife you will be reunited with your family, right? So he was solving real, at a minimum, he's solving real sociological problems of the day. So I urge people to view him with some charity in that regard. He is in Nauvoo, and Joseph Smith joins the Nauvoo Lodge. And in Nauvoo, the lodge initiates, passes, and raises him without any problems. And then he is so impressed by Masonic degrees that he encourages every eligible Mormon male to join the lodge.
Wow.
And very swiftly, now the Grand Lodge in Illinois at the time had just recovered from having gone dark. And so they're very nervous, they feel very tender. And so they use the excuse that the Nauvoo Lodge was violating the rule that sets the mandatory time between degrees. Most jurisdictions have an amount of time that you have to have between your first degree and your second degree before you can receive your second degree and your second degree and your third degree, right? They use that as a reason to yank the Nauvoo Lodge charter. There is no question in my mind that religious discrimination played some role in that decision making.
Yeah.
Mormons were not popular with wider society at this time. They were viewed as being cultish. They were viewed as acting in their own interest. Actually, come here.
She's fine.
Okay. They're viewed as acting in their own interest rather than in the interest of the greater community. So there's an election in the area coming up, and Joseph Smith is running for office, and there's a newspaper that's printing anti-Joseph Smith articles, and a group of over-enthusiastic Mormons, you know, the same guys that were the over-enthusiastic Masons in the Morgan affair have now transplanted themselves into this story, and they go and they destroy the printing press of that newspaper. And Joseph Smith and his brother end up getting arrested in the neighboring town of Carthage, I believe, and being held in jail. At which point a mob appears at the Carthage jail and demands that they be turned over to them. They aren't. The mob storms the building. And in the course of storming the building, Joseph Smith is shot and killed. And it is said that he was shot and killed while attempting to appeal for aid after the manner of a Master Mason. There's some controversy about that, and knowledgeable listeners will think to themselves about the circumstances and him being shot and whether or not it's legit that he was appealing for assistance. The story has often been told that the mob had a number of Masons in it who were upset that the widow of a Mason was included in a plural marriage with Joseph Smith. Whether or not that's true, I haven't found any convincing source. Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Smith, question mark, it then appears in a newspaper story where she is recorded as having been clutching an anti-Masonic book while weeping over Joseph Smith's body while it laid in state. I can only imagine that the anti-Masonic book was Morgan's exposure to the fraternity, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so then she shows up one more time in legal records when George Harris, who by now has left the Mormon Church and has been excommunicated, sues her for divorce on the grounds of abandonment. And then she is alleged to have joined a Catholic convent after leaving the Mormon Church herself. And that's Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris Smith in 10 minutes.